It all started on what seemed like an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I had just returned from work, hoping to relax for a bit on my porch with a glass of iced tea. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something unusual, a small stack of event rental chairs piled near the curb, along with a delivery van idling on the street. At first, I assumed someone in the neighborhood was hosting a graduation party or maybe a birthday bash. It wasn't until I stepped out of my car and was greeted by a stranger, clipboard in hand, who casually asked if I was the homeowner, that I realized something was off. The man proceeded to explain that he was with a wedding planning company, there to coordinate a big ceremony that weekend. He rattled off details about tents, floral arrangements, catering schedules, and even a DJ set up near my backyard oak tree. I stood there blinking, utterly confused, trying to process how on earth any of this involved me. When I asked him what address he had on his paperwork, he confidently read off my address, complete with my lot number, and smiled as if everything was perfectly normal. Still stunned, I walked around the side of my house only to find more strangers bustling around, rolling carts, and unloading boxes of decor. A couple of workers were already measuring my lawn for an aisle runner. It was like watching a bizarre scene from a movie, people treating my private yard like it was a community event center. I started asking pointed questions, but all I got were polite shrugs or deflections. They were just hired help. After all, following orders from whoever booked them. The audacity of it all began to sink in. Who would have the gall to plan a wedding on my property without even notifying me, much less asking permission? The more I thought about it, the more obvious the answer became. My meddling, overreaching, power-hungry HOA. Our HOA had a reputation for pushing boundaries. They'd fine neighbors for putting out Halloween decorations too early, sent nasty letters for minor paint touch-ups that didn't perfectly match pre-approved colors, and even once tried to ban backyard vegetable gardens for aesthetic reasons. But this was an entirely new level of arrogance. Scheduling a full-scale wedding on someone's private property without so much as a knock on the door or a formal request was beyond anything I could have imagined. It felt like a violation of not just my land, but my sense of security and basic ownership rights. I immediately marched over to the HOA office, which conveniently sits just a few streets over in a tidy brick building that always seemed a little too smug for its own good. The manager was out, but one of the board members, a stiff-looking man with a perfect part in his silver hair, greeted me with an overly sweet smile. When I explained what was happening at my house, expecting shock or at least concern, he simply nodded like it was old news. In fact, he proceeded to tell me that yes, the HOA had indeed agreed to allow a local couple, some distant relatives of another board member, to hold their wedding on community grounds, and since my backyard backed up to a shared greenbelt, they had just decided it was the most scenic spot. That's when my blood really started to boil. My backyard isn't a community greenbelt. It's deeded land, clearly marked in county records, maintained entirely by me, and fully within my private property lines. The fact that the HOA could be so careless, or worse, so brazenly manipulative, left me fuming. I pointed all this out to him, expecting a quick backpedal. Instead, he barely seemed fazed. He waved his hand dismissively, claiming it was all done for the benefit of the neighborhood, to foster goodwill and community spirit. If I truly had concerns, he said, I should take it up formally at the next board meeting, in 3 weeks. Meanwhile, the wedding was scheduled for this Saturday. Walking out of that office, I felt a mix of disbelief and outrage. It wasn't just the inconvenience or the shock of strangers treating my property like a public park. It was the principle of the thing. The HOA had decided, without consulting me at all, to host a large, disruptive event on land they didn't own or control. They didn't care about the legal lines or the notion of personal boundaries. They had crossed a line so far that I couldn't see it in the rearview mirror. As I drove back home, my mind was already racing through the possibilities of what I could do next to remind them exactly whose land they had tried to commandeer. When I pulled back up to my house after that infuriating meeting with the HOA board member, I was half hoping maybe the wedding crew had come to their senses and packed up. But as I turned onto my street, the sight that greeted me only stoked the fire burning in my chest. The number of delivery vans had multiplied, now lining the curb like a parade. Workers in matching polo shirts were marching across my lawn hauling long wooden beams, buckets of fresh flowers, string lights, and massive floral arches. A catering truck was parked practically in my driveway, its staff unloading crates of what smelled like expensive hors d'oeuvres. There were even portable bathrooms being maneuvered into the far corner of my side yard by a couple of sweating guys who looked none too thrilled about the task. As I stepped out of my car, I could barely take 2 steps before a cheerful young woman with a headset and a clipboard bustled up to me, chirping about table layouts and photo backdrops. When I tried to interrupt her to make it clear this was my private property and none of this should be happening, she gave me a perplexed look, then flipped through her paperwork. With a half-apologetic smile, she assured me everything had been arranged and paid for by the HOA, that they had the green light to transform the space. It was as if I was a stubborn obstacle on my own land. Even more insulting, she gently urged me to be careful walking around so I wouldn't disrupt the floral installations they'd just finished placing. I moved past her, shaking my head in disbelief, and surveyed the chaos unfolding across my yard. A group of workers were pounding stakes into the ground to anchor a large wedding tent, completely oblivious to the sprinkler lines I had buried there just last summer. Others were stringing Edison bulbs from poles driven into my carefully maintained flower beds. My garden path, which I'd spent years perfecting with hand-laid pavers and dwarf lavender, was being smothered by rolled-out carpet that would apparently serve as the bridal aisle. I could see fresh gouges in my grass from carts and dollies, and dirt piled where they'd tried to level a spot for a portable bar. Then there were the people I didn't even recognize, drifting in and out of my backyard like they owned the place. A photographer was scouting angles near my patio, taking test shots of my hedges and ancient oak tree. A woman in a smart pantsuit who seemed to be coordinating the whole ordeal was barking orders into her phone while pointing directly at my house, instructing someone to move the cake table closer to my living room windows for better natural light. Everywhere I turned, there were strangers treating my personal sanctuary like a rented party venue, and not a single one of them seemed the least bit concerned that I had never agreed to any of it. Neighbors started to appear on the sidewalks, drawn by the spectacle. Some stood there gawking, others gave me awkward little waves, clearly unsure of what was going on. I overheard snippets of gossip about how lovely it was that the HOA finally did something nice for the community and how lucky I was to have my house featured in such a beautiful event. Lucky! That word made me grit my teeth. These people had no idea that not only had I not agreed to this, but I was actively trying to stop it. The absurdity of the whole situation was almost enough to make me laugh, if I wasn't so furious. I walked around to the back porch, hoping for some kind of sanity check, and found yet another crew busy setting up a dance floor that extended dangerously close to the roots of my oak tree. A few workers were rolling out heavy platforms, oblivious to the fact that compacting the soil could permanently damage the tree's health. I tried to talk to one of them to get him to stop before something irreparable happened, but he just shrugged and pointed to the wedding planner who was still pacing my lawn with her headset, orchestrating every detail like this was a hotel ballroom and not someone's personal backyard. It was in that moment, standing there surrounded by chaos and the total disregard for my property, that the weight of it really hit me. These people didn't see this as my home. To them, it was just a convenient location, a blank canvas for their perfect day. They didn't care about the sweat equity I'd poured into landscaping, the thousands I'd spent on lawn care, or the emotional value of that old oak tree that had shaded generations of my family gatherings. To them, it was just a venue booked by the HOA, signed off without so much as a courtesy knock on my front door. The complete lack of respect left me with a tightening in my chest that was quickly morphing into resolve. If the HOA thought they could bulldoze over my rights with catering trays and flower arches, they were about to learn that the only bulldozer on this property would be one I called myself. The next morning, I decided I'd try once more to confront the people responsible, to give them a final opportunity to come to their senses before I took things to a level that no one in the neighborhood would soon forget. I walked back over to the HOA office, hoping to catch the president herself, a woman named Marcia who had developed quite a reputation over the years for her iron grip on the board's decisions. Marcia was known for her immaculately styled hair, her sharp suits, and the way she would smile sweetly at you while stabbing you with fines and rule changes that somehow always seemed to benefit her close circle. When I stepped inside, I could hear voices drifting from the back office, laughter, the clink of coffee mugs. I waited at the reception desk until finally Marcia emerged, her expression pinching into a tight smile the moment she saw me. She greeted me like I was an old friend, asking how my yard was holding up with all the exciting preparations. The nerve it took to say that, to act as if this was some gift they were generously bestowing on me instead of a blatant trespass, made my blood pressure spike. I told her flat out that I wanted the entire event called off. That was my private property and no contract existed with my signature on it permitting the use of my land for a wedding. Marcia's face didn't so much as flinch. She launched into a rehearsed monologue about community engagement and building neighborly bonds, punctuated by the occasional condescending pat on my arm. When I pressed her, pointing out the obvious legal problems, that they had no written easement, no lease, absolutely no right to authorize a massive private event on my land, she simply brushed it all aside. According to her, the HOA covenants were broad enough that anything deemed to be for the general benefit of the community could be approved by a majority vote. They had apparently held a quick vote among the board members, not the actual homeowners, and decided my yard was the perfect backdrop. Trying to stay calm, I asked to see the actual vote records. She was quick to deflect, saying the minutes hadn't yet been formally distributed, but that I could always submit a written request and perhaps review them at next month's meeting. Meanwhile, the wedding was only days away. It was clear she had no intention of slowing things down. In fact, she seemed to relish the idea of stonewalling me, as if daring me to escalate it to lawyers or local authorities, fully confident that most people wouldn't bother. Her smug demeanor made something crystallize inside me. I realized that trying to reason with the HOA was going to be as pointless as trying to negotiate with a brick wall. They operated in their own little fiefdom, insulated by bureaucracy and a thick layer of neighborly politeness that too many residents were afraid to pierce. As I left, Marcia called after me with a syrupy reminder to enjoy the festivities this weekend. After all, it's not every day your house gets to be the centerpiece of something so special. I didn't even bother turning around. By the time I stepped outside, the sun was high and the sidewalks were busy with more vendors arriving. A florist van had pulled up, blocking part of my driveway, unloading buckets of delicate white roses that were destined to be draped all over my porch. A crew was inspecting the electrical hookups by my garage to see where they could plug in sound equipment and mood lighting. It was as if my ownership of the property had evaporated, replaced by the HOA's delusion that they could commandeer it for their own showpiece event. Neighbors were starting to mill around, curious about the growing spectacle. A couple I barely knew stopped to chat, gushing about how beautiful everything was shaping up to be and how generous it was of me to volunteer my home for the occasion. They had clearly swallowed the HOA's story whole, believing this was all done with my enthusiastic blessing. I forced a tight smile and didn't bother correcting them. The truth would be obvious soon enough. Later that afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table going over property records, flipping through my deed, the original plat maps, anything that showed without question that my backyard was not, in any way, common space. I even dug up the letter from the title company from when I purchased the house, spelling out the precise boundaries of my lot. Every document reinforced the same fact. The HOA had absolutely no legal claim to authorize anything on my property. The more I read, the calmer I felt, not because I was any less angry, but because I knew I had every right to do whatever it took to stop this nonsense. I didn't need to beg Marcia for permission or wait for some rubber-stamped board meeting. I didn't have to play along with their fantasy. I just had to decide exactly how far I was willing to go to protect what was mine and make sure they never try to pull something like this again. That evening, I sat alone on my porch with a notepad in my lap, scribbling down every possible angle I could think of to shut this whole debacle down. I thought about calling the sheriff right then and there to report trespassing, but something told me it wouldn't be that simple. The last thing I wanted was a drawn-out dispute where officers showed up, shrugged, and chalked it up to a civil matter. I wanted something that would make a clear, immediate statement, something that would send the HOA scurrying back into their little office and never dreaming of abusing my property rights again. As the sun sank below the rooftops, painting the sky in bands of orange and violet, my eyes drifted over the growing mess in my yard. From where I sat, I could see the tops of rented tents already staked down, the spools of twinkle lights strung from my tree branches, the caterers' prep stations cluttering my garden beds. It was all a physical manifestation of the HOA's arrogance, daring me to do something about it. I thought about what mattered most to me. It wasn't the handful of neighbors who might tisk-tisk at any drastic measures I took. It wasn't the delicate feelings of some strangers planning to say their vows on ground they had no right to stand on. It was the principle that my home was mine. Every mortgage payment, every weekend spent mowing and planting, every hour fixing up my deck, all of it came back to the simple fact that this was my property. Not the HOA's, not the community's to borrow for some showy event. Mine. And I was ready to defend it. The next morning, after almost no sleep, I started making phone calls. Not to lawyers. I'd get to them soon enough if the HOA wanted to push things legally, but to a heavy equipment rental company a few towns over. I explained, with what I'm sure was an unsettling calmness, that I needed a small bulldozer delivered by the weekend. When a man on the line asked if it was for clearing brush or landscaping, I told him it was for reminding some people where the property line starts and ends. He laughed, thinking it was a joke. I didn't bother correcting him. We arranged for delivery Friday afternoon. The moment I hung up, I felt something uncoil in my chest. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was a grim satisfaction. I had just drawn a line in the dirt, and soon it would be a very literal one. By noon that day, more wedding vendors were arriving. Someone had started building an archway near the edge of my patio, hammering together beams that were gouging into the soil I'd painstakingly nurtured. Workers carried in crates of wine and glassware, treating my backyard like a loading dock. I stood there in plain sight, arms crossed, daring any of them to ask my permission. No one did. They were so fully bought into the HOA's illusion of authority that they didn't even look twice at the actual homeowner. That only steeled my resolve. Neighbors wandered by in little knots, whispering to each other. A few waved, offered hopeful smiles, made comments about how wonderful it all was. I nodded, saying nothing, letting them think whatever they wanted for the moment. I was done trying to convince anyone of how outrageous this situation was. The only people who needed convincing now were the ones who would be hauling their fancy decorations back out once I was through making my point. When Friday rolled around, the rumble of a diesel engine on my street drew every curious head to their windows. The flatbed truck pulled up in front of my house with a bright yellow bulldozer chained down on the back. The driver hopped out, cheerful and oblivious, and handed me a clipboard. I signed with a flourish, thanked him, and watched as he unloaded the machine onto the asphalt. It looked massive against the neat rows of suburban houses. The moment it rolled onto my driveway, the wedding planners and caterers scattered like pigeons, eyes wide, murmuring into their headsets. I climbed up, settled into the driver's seat, and fired it up. The roar of the engine vibrated through my chest like a war drum. From that high perch, I could see the entire yard laid out below me, littered with delicate decor and half-assembled installations. The wedding coordinator was sprinting toward me, waving her hands, shouting something I couldn't hear over the rumble. I didn't care. I tapped the throttle and began edging forward, slowly carving a path across my own lawn, making sure every person there understood this wasn't a polite disagreement. This was me reclaiming what was rightfully mine in the most undeniable way possible. The looks on their faces told me they finally grasped the reality that the HOA had been trying so hard to distort. There would be no wedding on my property, not without my explicit say-so, not under any circumstances. When the blade of the bulldozer touched the edge of the freshly laid carpet aisle, I felt a rush of adrenaline that drowned out every bit of doubt I might have had left. The look on the wedding coordinator's face was something between horror and disbelief, her hands fluttering uselessly at her sides as if she was trying to physically hold the scene together through sheer will. Behind her, caterers and decorators froze mid-task, clutching trays of glassware or spools of ribbon, all of them staring at me with mouths open. I didn't accelerate quickly. I didn't need to. The slow, deliberate grind of steel over earth was enough to make my point clearer than any lawyer's letter ever could. Each foot the dozer crawled forward seemed to snap some unspoken spell the HOA had cast over my property. The rolled-out white carpet crumpled under the treads, then disappeared completely into churned-up dirt. Decorative stakes marking out the aisle snapped like toothpicks. The neat lines of folding chairs, half arranged into graceful rows, tipped and scattered. I adjusted my path slightly, easing around the oak tree I'd cared for all these years, but making absolutely sure to flatten the elaborate floral stands that someone had parked at its base. Roses and hydrangeas that probably cost a small fortune vanished under the weight of my machine, turning into a crushed, muddy paste. From my seat up there, I could see the entire scene unfold with almost theatrical precision. The headset-wearing staff were on their radios, gesturing wildly, their eyes darting between me and the street like they were hoping the cavalry would come charging in to stop me. A few even pulled out phones to record, probably hoping to catch me doing something they could use later. I gave them a slow, casual wave. Let them film it. Every second was evidence of how far they'd pushed me and how firmly I intended to push back. At some point, one of the HOA board members arrived. Not Marcia this time, but her smarmy sidekick Greg, the same silver-haired man who had brushed me off days earlier in their office. He jogged up my driveway, waving his arms and shouting, his face redder than I'd ever seen it. I throttled down the engine just enough to hear him as he launched into a sputtering tirade about how this was community property and I was destroying valuable association assets. The irony was so thick, I almost laughed. Here he was, accusing me of damaging assets that had been illegally installed on my private land without permission, acting like I was the criminal for daring to protect what I owned. I cut him off with a calm explanation that this was my property, clearly documented by the county, and that the HOA had no standing to schedule anything here, certainly not a full-scale wedding. His mouth opened and closed like a fish. He tried to argue something about precedent and neighborhood spirit, but it all fell flat. The truth was written in every line of my deed and every survey map filed at the courthouse. I told him bluntly that if he didn't like the way I was maintaining my property, he was welcome to take it up in court. Meanwhile, the dozer idled patiently beneath me, ready to continue its slow path of correction through the rest of the unauthorized installations. He threatened me with fines. I smiled and told him he was welcome to try. Fines required an actual violation of HOA rules, not the other way around. This was their overreach, not mine. The more he blustered, the more obvious it became to everyone watching that the HOA had grossly overstepped. A few neighbors had gathered by now, drawn by the racket of the diesel engine and the undeniable spectacle of it all. Some of them looked uncomfortable, unsure who to side with. Others gave me small nods or even faint smiles, like they were secretly rooting for someone to finally stand up to the HOA's nonsense. I steered the dozer toward the last cluster of tables and fancy parasols, taking my time. Each slow rotation of the treads sunk deep into the carefully groomed lawn the wedding planners had just finished prepping. Table linens flipped up like startled birds. Centerpieces of floating candles and tiny white blossoms tipped over, spilling water and petals into the dirt. It felt like rolling back an invasion, reclaiming every square foot they had tried to annex with their arrogance and rented decor. When I finally powered down the engine, the silence was almost startling. People stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. The wedding coordinator was frantically on her phone, probably trying to salvage the event at some other location. Greg stood there breathing hard, his face pale now instead of red. I climbed down, boots landing solidly on the ground that, despite all the chaos, was still mine, every inch of it legally and unequivocally. And for the first time in days, I felt the tension ease from my shoulders, replaced by the deep, unshakable certainty that I had done exactly what needed to be done. Of course, here's keynote number 6 expanded into about 700 words, without headings or ending sentences. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than any official HOA newsletter ever could. By the next morning, my phone was lighting up with texts and missed calls, some from neighbors I barely knew who now apparently felt compelled to weigh in. A few were bold enough to show up on my porch, half apologetic, half curious, wanting to hear my side straight from the source. Most of them opened with the same awkward line. "I heard about what happened yesterday." They said it with cautious politeness, as if approaching a wild animal they weren't sure was still dangerous. A couple of longtime residents actually gave me quiet words of support. One older gentleman from down the block stopped by as I was sweeping up bits of broken floral arch from my driveway. He gave me a slow nod and told me someone needed to remind the HOA who owned what around here. He'd lived through years of their pettiness. Letters about fence heights, fines over a shed door painted one shade too dark, and he seemed almost grateful that I'd drawn a line none of them had ever dared to. His approval didn't erase the frustration of the last week, but it did settle something in my chest. Maybe this wasn't just about me and my property. Maybe it was about putting the brakes on an HOA that had gotten far too comfortable making decisions that weren't theirs to make. Meanwhile, Marcia finally decided to appear in person. Midday, her shiny black SUV pulled up in front of my house like it was arriving at a board gala. Instead of a confrontation she'd long delayed. She stepped out impeccably dressed, sunglasses perched on her nose, clipboard in hand. From the porch, I watched her take in the sight of my torn-up yard, her lips tightening at the muddy tire tracks and the dismantled remnants of what had almost been a wedding venue. She walked up my drive with a kind of forced composure, greeting me in that sugary tone that did nothing to hide the steel underneath. She launched right into her speech about unfortunate misunderstandings and the need to preserve community harmony. Without skipping a beat, she tried to pivot the blame, suggesting that perhaps the wedding planner had misinterpreted the board's authorization, that maybe certain documents weren't filed properly. She sprinkled in carefully chosen words like allegedly and miscommunication, clearly hoping to muddy the waters just enough to avoid outright admitting fault. It was so transparent, it almost made me laugh. When I didn't offer her an easy path out, when I just stood there silent, arms folded, she moved on to her real agenda. She told me the HOA would have to discuss possible fines for the damage to common aesthetics, implying that my bulldozer had somehow violated landscaping codes that they love to trot out in letters about slightly overgrown bushes. I let her finish, then calmly pointed out that the landscaping codes didn't apply to undoing illegal trespassing on private property. I reminded her that my deed and county plat maps were still on file down at the courthouse if she needed a refresher on who owned this land. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes darted away for just a second, and I knew she understood exactly how precarious her position was. Marcia tried one last tactic, the threat of dragging this into prolonged litigation. She hinted at how expensive lawyers could be, how exhausting it was to deal with legal disputes. It was the oldest HOA trick in the book, relying on intimidation and the average homeowner's fear of costly court battles to keep them quiet. But I was done being intimidated. I told her that if she or the board wanted to escalate it, they were welcome to do so. I already had a folder of documentation ready to hand over to an attorney, complete with photos of their unauthorized vendors setting up on my lawn and invoices showing none of this had ever been contracted with me. I even had video from my own doorbell camera of the workers trampling onto my property with zero explanation. Her expression soured then. The pleasant mask slipped just enough to show the irritation underneath. She promised the board would review the matter further and stalked back to her SUV, not bothering with pleasantries this time. Watching her drive off, I felt a profound sense of relief, mixed with the steely satisfaction that comes from standing your ground no matter how many suits show up to tell you that you shouldn't. That weekend, my property was quiet again. No catering trucks, no decorators, no clueless strangers treating my yard like their reception hall. I walked the perimeter of my backyard, tracing the property lines in my head the same way I had when I first bought this place, feeling the old pride return. The oak tree stood undisturbed, the flower beds a bit roughed up, but still rooted right where I planted them. Neighbors walked by and nodded. A few even stopped to say they admired how I handle things, that it was about time someone reminded the HOA they couldn't just rewrite property lines with the stroke of a pen at a board meeting. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than any official HOA newsletter ever could. By the next morning, my phone was lighting up with texts and missed calls, some from neighbors I barely knew who now apparently felt compelled to weigh in. A few were bold enough to show up on my porch, half apologetic, half curious, wanting to hear my side straight from the source. Most of them opened with the same awkward line. "I heard about what happened yesterday." They said it with cautious politeness, as if approaching a wild animal they weren't sure was still dangerous. A couple of longtime residents actually gave me quiet words of support. One older gentleman from down the block stopped by as I was sweeping up bits of broken floral arch from my driveway. He gave me a slow nod and told me someone needed to remind the HOA who owned what around here. He'd lived through years of their pettiness. Letters about fence heights, fines over a shed door painted one shade too dark, and he seemed almost grateful that I'd drawn a line none of them had ever dared to. His approval didn't erase the frustration of the last week, but it did settle something in my chest. Maybe this wasn't just about me and my property. Maybe it was about putting the brakes on an HOA that had gotten far too comfortable making decisions that weren't theirs to make. Meanwhile, Marcia finally decided to appear in person. Midday, her shiny black SUV pulled up in front of my house like it was arriving at a board gala, instead of a confrontation she'd long delayed. She stepped out impeccably dressed, sunglasses perched on her nose, clipboard in hand. From the porch, I watched her take in the sight of my torn-up yard, her lips tightening at the muddy tire tracks and the dismantled remnants of what had almost been a wedding venue. She walked up my drive with a kind of forced composure, greeting me in that sugary tone that did nothing to hide the steel underneath. She launched right into her speech about unfortunate misunderstandings and the need to preserve community harmony. Without skipping a beat, she tried to pivot the blame, suggesting that perhaps the wedding planner had misinterpreted the board's authorization, that maybe certain documents weren't filed properly. She sprinkled in carefully chosen words like allegedly and miscommunication, clearly hoping to muddy the waters just enough to avoid outright admitting fault. It was so transparent, it almost made me laugh. Why didn't offer her an easy path out? Why just stood there silent, arms folded? She moved on to her real agenda. She told me the HOA would have to discuss possible fines for the damage to common aesthetics, implying that my bulldozer had somehow violated landscaping codes that they love to trot out in letters about slightly overgrown bushes. I let her finish, then calmly pointed out that the landscaping codes didn't apply to undoing illegal trespassing on private property. I reminded her that my deed and county plat maps were still on file down at the courthouse if she needed a refresher on who owned this land. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes darted away for just a second, and I knew she understood exactly how precarious her position was. Marcia tried one last tactic, the threat of dragging this into prolonged litigation. She hinted at how expensive lawyers could be, how exhausting it was to deal with legal disputes. It was the oldest HOA trick in the book, relying on intimidation and the average homeowner's fear of costly court battles to keep them quiet. But I was done being intimidated. I told her that if she or the board wanted to escalate it, they were welcome to do so. I already had a folder of documentation ready to hand over to an attorney, complete with photos of their unauthorized vendors setting up on my lawn and invoices showing none of this had ever been contracted with me. I even had video from my own doorbell camera of the workers trampling onto my property with zero explanation. Her expression soured then. The pleasant mask slipped just enough to show the irritation underneath. She promised the board would review the matter further and stalked back to her SUV, not bothering with pleasantries this time. Watching her drive off, I felt a profound sense of relief, mixed with the steely satisfaction that comes from standing your ground no matter how many suits show up to tell you that you shouldn't. That weekend, my property was quiet again. No catering trucks, no decorators, no clueless strangers treating my yard like their reception hall. I walked the perimeter of my backyard, tracing the property lines in my head the same way, I had when I first bought this place, feeling the old pride return. The oak tree stood undisturbed, the flower beds a bit roughed up but still rooted right where I planted them. Neighbors walked by and nodded. A few even stopped to say they admired how I handled things, that it was about time someone reminded the HOA they couldn't just rewrite property lines with the stroke of a pen at a board meeting.